Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Pressure on Putin as Ukraine agrees to Trump's ceasefire proposal. Trump's trade war intensifies as Canada and Europe announce retaliatory tariffs on the US. The US joins indirect talks between Israel and Hamas on extending the fragile ceasefire in Gaza. To our top story, the Kremlin has said Russia is carefully studying the statements proposed in the US-Ukraine ceasefire deal and won't decide on the proposals until it receives information from the US. Sources have also said it will be difficult for Putin to accept the plan as it stands. Ukraine has backed the 30-day ceasefire plan after talks in Saudi Arabia, and President Donald Trump is expected to call Putin this week. Earlier today, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said everything depends on Russia now. Let's take a look.
Today, everything depends on the fact whether Russia wants a ceasefire or to continue killing people. Today, it fully depends on this country. United States of America demonstrated its steps and position. Ukraine demonstrated and outlined its position in a very direct way, without any reservations, and Russia will have to answer to that. One may see different results achieved in Saudi Arabia. One saw restoration of aid as the main result. Another saw first steps towards the end of the war as the main result. I believe that the meeting itself in Saudi Arabia ruined Russian plans to escalate relations between Ukraine and the United States. On the contrary, there is de-escalation.
We can now go live to Moscow to speak to our correspondent, Dasha Chernyshova. Dasha, all eyes are now on Moscow and this highly anticipated call between Trump and Putin. The US is also saying the ball is in their court.
That's right. The Kremlin has confirmed that Moscow is waiting to be briefed by the American side on the results and the positions of what has been discussed between the Ukrainian delegation and the American delegation in Saudi Arabia. And Moscow will be closely studying and examining those proposals. When it comes to the potential ceasefire in Ukraine, the Kremlin said we should not be getting ahead before Russia conducts this examination. And also the Russian officials insist that there will be the meeting between the Russian and American representatives that has been confirmed. The Kremlin has said indeed that will be taking place in the matter of days, and also noted that it is possible that President Vladimir Putin and the US President Donald Trump will arrange a phone conversation to have a more detailed exchange of views on this current situation. This phone call could be set up very speedily, according to the Russian side. So definitely Moscow says it is not in a rush. It wants the full examination and will be waiting the American colleagues to provide more details.
Some sources are reportedly saying it will be difficult for Putin to accept the plan as it stands right now. What are the key sticking points for Vladimir Putin and the Russians?
Well, Vladimir Putin has long ago said that Russia will not be accepting any temporary solutions to the conflict in Ukraine, and ceasefire is not acceptable unless it is part of the permanent deal on Ukraine settlement. The idea in Moscow is that if there is the temporary ceasefire for 30 days or for some other period, this time will be used by the Western countries to rearm Ukraine and for the Ukrainian troops to regroup on the battlefield. And Moscow insists that this is exactly exactly what Moscow doesn't want to see, because it doesn't want this conflict to erupt. Once again, it wants the settlement for Ukraine to be lasting, and for that, the root causes of the conflict have to be addressed, namely the situation between Russia and NATO, with Ukraine being dragged into NATO's orbit, as Russia insists. And also another issue that you have to keep in mind, that Ukraine has once again started to receive the weapons and the intelligence data from the United States. This is another issue that will be concerning Moscow, because Moscow has also said before that the halt of those supplies was a good signal that Ukraine could be forced into peace. So from the Russian perspective, it is not really genuine attempt to bring the settlement of this conflict, but as many Russian lawmakers have been saying throughout the day, more of an imitation of the peace process.
And Dasha, this all comes at a time when Russian forces are advancing in Kursk as well. How will this affect Putin's stance on the proposed ceasefire deal?
Well, certainly the advance of the Russian troops in the Kursk region is good news for the Russian side. We've heard the Russian MOD confirming 5 more settlements have been taken by the Russians under their control, liberated from the Ukrainian side. Ukraine held under its control large swaths of Russia's Kursk region. That incursion began last August, and many were saying that that was Ukraine's best card when it comes to the possible negotiations. Now we are hearing that the Russian troops have managed also to start squeezing the Ukrainians out from the city of Sudzha, the key center there, the city between the two countries. And definitely that means that the Ukrainian troops are encircled there, and that it is just the matter of time and short period of time when Russia fully regains control over its territory. So certainly the situation there is going to impact any sort of negotiations. But one way or another, Moscow has been holding the upper hand on the entire front line, making gains in Donbas, making gains in Kursk. And many political analysts have been saying, why would Russia agree to something that is unacceptable for Moscow while it has the upper hand on the battlefield?
Shortly after Ukraine agreed to the proposal, the US agreed to resume military aid and intelligence sharing. You mentioned that earlier with Ukraine. What does Trump need to do now to get Russia to agree to this ceasefire? Some are saying that Trump is trying to call Vladimir Putin's bluff.
Well, we understand that Trump administration will be likely threatening Russia with more sanctions, more economic pressure should Russia actually refuse. And that has been the idea among many political scientists here who have been watching the situation, suggesting that if that is the case, then certainly Moscow rejecting the ceasefire will find itself in a very difficult situation. However, it is still unclear what sort of decision Moscow will make. There could be nuances that have not been made public, at least at this stage. And obviously for Russia, what will be important to accept any ceasefire is that in the period of time of the ceasefire, there is no rearmament of Ukraine by the countries of the Rammstein group and other countries that have been helping Ukraine militarily. That could be one of the options that have been put forward by the political observers.
Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow, thank you for joining me. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines today. Iran's president has said his country will not negotiate with the US, telling President Trump to do whatever the hell you want. President Masoud Pezeshkian told Iranian media it was unacceptable for the US to give orders and to make threats. Days earlier, Iran's supreme leader said Tehran would not be bullied into negotiations after Trump sent a letter urging Iran to engage in discussions regarding a new nuclear deal. Greenland's centre-right party has won the country's general election in a surprise victory. The Democrat Party is in favour of becoming independent from Denmark and will now form a coalition. Party leader Jens Fredrik Nielsen told reporters Greenland needs us to stand together in a time of great interest from outside, as he referenced President Trump's pledge to take over the territory. At least 300 passengers have been freed after a Pakistan train siege. The Baloch Liberation Army targeted the train carrying the 400 passengers, taking them hostage. At least 33 militants have been killed during the incident. Officials say the siege has now ended. And a British man who ran the length of Africa has set himself a new endurance challenge. Russ Cook, also known as the hardest geezer, is running 3,000 kilometres across New Zealand. The 27-year-old has started at Stirling Point in Bluff and will run for 60 days, finishing at Cape Renija in Northland. Now, the EU has announced it will impose countermeasures in retaliation after President Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminium imports came into effect this morning. The president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, called the 25% US levies on global imports of the metals unjustified trade restrictions. And in the last hour, President Trump has insisted the United States will win a trade war with the European Union. Meanwhile, Canada has also hit back with its own retaliatory tariffs, saying we will not back down. For more on this, I'm joined by Nicolas, who's Executive Vice President at C3 Solutions, a public policy organisation that focuses on energy, economic and environmental policy. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. First of all, the EU and Canada has hit back against Donald Trump's tariffs. Do you think this is a wise decision? It's very much in stark comparison to the UK, who's reacted extremely calmly.
Yeah, it's a regrettable decision for everyone, most notably the consumers of all of these countries, the families and businesses that have to pay for these tariffs. That said, I understand the frustration of the Canadians and the Europeans who have been good trading partners with the United States. And these tariffs, really what President Trump said in his intentions to win is that nobody wins a trade war. And really, it's the consumers of all kinds that end up losing by paying more for all of these goods and services.
Yes, absolutely. And like you say there, Trump standing absolutely defiant, saying that he will win the trade war. It's a brighter day for stock markets after the trade tariff tantrums of recent days. Why are investors turning so cautious when it comes to Trump's tariffs? Because he spoke extensively about implementing tariffs in the election campaign.
Yeah, that's right. I think based on what we've seen before from the Trump administration in the first term is that he would often use tariffs as a threat to get something he wanted on another policy, whether it be on immigration reform or on things like keeping fentanyl out of the United States. And these were really kind of thinly veiled threats, knowing that there may be some sort of action from these trading partners, and therefore the tariffs would not be implemented. He is taking a much different approach this time, in which these tariffs are going into effect and the markets are responding. And I think they'll continue to respond the longer these tariffs are enacted, given the fact that the prices and the amount of goods, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars worth of industrial goods that these tariffs are hitting. That's going to take a serious toll on the economic growth of the world.
Do you think Donald Trump will reverse these tariffs? As we know, he's a keen watcher of the stock markets. You're just talking about that. Could this be something that changes his mind?
I think that's something that they're discussing right now. He doesn't like to lose, obviously, and he likes to claim victory even when there may not have actually been a victory. So there have been some in his administration who are saying that this is just some of the short-term pain for the intended purposes of the tariffs. I strongly disagree with that. I think the more the tariffs in place, the longer they're in place, the more economic harm that's going to be imposed on America and our allies. And so there may be a scenario in which the economic pain gets so bad that he claims victory, even if there's not much victory to claim.
Yes, that's interesting because he obviously says there'll be short-term pain, and he has signposted that. Right now in the US and the allies, Donald Trump was elected on the fact that he could make America great again, elected on the fact that the economy would bounce back. What do you think this will do for his popularity, and how are people feeling this in their pockets?
Yeah, his popularity is at a low when it comes to approval ratings for the economy in both the first term and the second term. And so American families are paying attention to this. You know, he was elected largely on the promise that he was going to tame inflation, bring down the cost of food, of energy, of all of the things that are hitting American families' pocketbooks. And it's quickly demonstrating that this tariff idea and implementation is not the way to do so. It really cuts against much of his other agenda, which is to have energy dominance, to make America a hub of manufacturing and industrial growth. And if this persists, you know, he is going to have a difficult time gaining the confidence of the American people to handle the economy. I think a wiser course would be really to get rid of these tariffs, particularly with our allied partners in Europe and Canada and Mexico, and focus on a pro-growth tax policy that I think really can help bolster his agenda for economic well-being for families and businesses.
And finally, shares in Tesla are absolutely tanking, and we've seen Trump basically go all out to support the brand. You know, we've got pictures right now on the White House lawn, and there's a whole variety of Teslas there, and he's saying, I'm going to buy one, and he's really supporting Elon Musk. What do you make of all of this?
Yeah, it's an interesting way to go about things, to say the least. And it's, I talk about this with my friends and family all the time. I think folks on both the left and the right agree that we could all have more efficiency within the federal government, that we could find areas to slim down and trim the government, and that we need to address our federal debt. But the way that Elon Musk and the Doge team is going about it is not very popular, as indicated with what's happening with the Tesla stock. So I think this would be, you know, nothing more than a short-lived gimmick by the Trump administration to try to bolster any type of popularity with Tesla. But if this attack on kind of the government bloat is done so in such a reckless manner by Doge, I fear that it's more trouble for Tesla's stock moving forward.
Nicolas, Executive Vice President at C3 Solutions. It was great to have you on. I appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Let's take another look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. The captain of a cargo ship that collided with a US tanker has been identified as a Russian national. The 59-year-old remains in British custody after the crash in the North Sea on Monday. He's been held on suspicion of manslaughter by gross negligence over the collision, but has not been charged. The US Education Department is planning to cut around half of its workforce. It comes as the Trump administration pushes ahead with cuts to the federal government. The US president has long sought to eliminate the department. Over 2,000 people could be affected. A plane carrying the former Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte has arrived in the Netherlands after a delay during a layover in Dubai. Duterte was arrested yesterday after an ICC warrant accused the former leader of crimes against humanity. He's thought to be behind the deaths of 6,000 people who were shot dead during his campaign against drugs. And at least 256 cases of measles have been reported in Texas and New Mexico since an outbreak in January. That's after an increase of 28 cases over the last 5 days. The outbreak started in West Texas and caused the first measles death in the U.S. in a decade. Now, the disgraced movie mogul Harvey Weinstein is due to appear in court later today. The 72-year-old's retrial begins in Manhattan next month, nearly a year after New York's highest court overturned his 2020 conviction on rape and sexual assault charges. Today, a judge is expected to issue rulings on a variety of points in the case, including the scope of accuser testimony and potential expert witnesses. Sarah Firth has more on this story.
It was the visual that captured the fall of a once lauded movie mogul, now convicted rapist, frail and sick and reviled by many. It was in stark contrast to the glamour and smiles of the man who would go on to be convicted in 2020 of rape and sexual assault charges. Today, he's expected in a Manhattan court ahead of his retrial next month. A judge will issue rulings on what can be included in the new trial that will take place nearly a year after the city's highest court overturned his conviction.
Today's legal ruling is a great day for America because it instills in us the faith that there is a justice system, even though there's 100 cameras around, that a judge will sit in her chambers and look at the law and look at the precedent without fear of favor and say, I don't care who the defendant is. If it's a former president of the United States or the most storied Hollywood producer of our generation, the law applies to everyone.
Manhattan prosecutors said they've been investigating additional violent sexual assaults allegedly committed by Weinstein after more women agreed to testify against the Miramax studio co-founder. Weinstein denies ever having non-consensual sexual encounters with anyone. He might be a well-known Hollywood producer, but despite the reversal of Weinstein's New York conviction and the retrial set to start soon, he remains in custody at the Rikers Island jail complex for a separate rape conviction in California. And today's possible appearance from the once powerful Hollywood mogul will bring back into focus the women standing up in the Me Too movement. Sarah Firth, Al Arabiya News.
U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, has arrived in Qatar to discuss the next stage of the Gaza ceasefire. He's expected to meet the Qatari Prime Minister today and propose a deal which would include a 2-month extension of the ceasefire as well as the return of 10 hostages. The talks in Doha comes 2 days after an Israeli strike killed 8 Palestinians in Gaza, including a child. For more on this, I'm joined by former Israeli government spokesperson Eylon Levy, who is in Tel Aviv for us. Eylon, thank you so much for joining me. Let's just start with those talks in Qatar. What is Netanyahu actually hoping for in phase 2 of the ceasefire? And will there even be a phase 2 that includes a full withdrawal of Israeli forces or just an extension of phase 1?
Let's start with the fact that Hamas must release the hostages immediately and unconditionally. These negotiations are over the ransom that Israel is going to pay to get back the hostages who were abducted from their beds and are being starved and tortured, and Israel is willing to pay a price to get them out. But here's the problem with phase two. A whole world has been clear Hamas cannot remain the government of Gaza. The Arab League has said it, the United States has said it, the European Union has said it. Hamas cannot remain in power in Gaza. But the Hamas government interprets phase two as a license to remain in power and continue plotting more October 7th massacres. So I think it's clear to everyone phase two is unlikely to happen. That's why Israel and the United States are now trying to extend phase one. They're saying Israel and the US and the EU and the Arab League are saying Hamas can't stay. Hamas wants to stay. Let's push that off. And for now, let's get out as many hostages as we can in exchange for an extension in the ceasefire. We'll continue the pause in the fighting, and in exchange, Hamas will release the hostages it abducted illegally on October 7th and has been starving and torturing ever since.
So, Eylon, you speak there about the ceasefire, but Hamas is accusing Israel of not sticking to the original framework of the peace plan, and this is why we haven't seen the release of the hostages. What do you actually say to that?
Well, first, let's remember it's not a peace plan. This is a framework to reach a permanent ceasefire. But everyone knows there is no such thing as a permanent ceasefire with Hamas, which is a jihadi regime whose reason for existing is to wage war on Israel until there is no more Israel, okay? Now, there is a major disagreement between how Hamas interprets phase two and how Israel, the United States, the European Union, and the Arab League interpret it. Israel is saying this war has to end with all the hostages home and Hamas removed from power and disarmed, right? Because otherwise Hamas is going to start another war again, and we don't want more wars. We want this to be the last Gaza war. We don't want Hamas to be in a position to declare war ever again. But Hamas is trying to hold on to the hostages as insurance to remain in power so that it can plot the next war against Israel, because that is Hamas's ideology. So Israel is saying Hamas has to release the hostages immediately. It has to release them unconditionally. And if it doesn't want a return to the fighting in the war that it started, it needs to continue releasing the hostages it has no right to be holding in the first place.
Israel's energy minister has recently cut off electricity coming into Gaza. Aid deliveries have also been blocked. What is the intention of these actions, and what are the possible outcomes?
The Hamas government of Gaza declared war on October 7th. The Hamas government of Gaza is refusing to surrender, and the Hamas government of Gaza is starving hostages it abducted from their beds over 500 days ago. And Israel is now telling the Hamas government of Gaza, you have to take responsibility. There are consequences for an act of aggression, for invading our country, for taking our citizens, and for starving them. And Hamas has to let the hostages go. I mean, it's absurd that Israel has been providing electricity to the Gaza Strip until now. This is enemy territory. Hamas took over in 2007 and started launching rockets at Israel. On October 7th, it invaded us. There is no country in history that supplies electricity to enemy territory that is at war with it, that waged war on it, and that is holding its citizens. So Israel is saying, if the Gaza Strip wants electricity, if it wants to receive supplies through Israel, great. That can happen when Gaza has a government that is committed to peace with Israel and not a permanent war against Israel. It's their choice.
What is Israel's priority right now? Is it the return of the hostages?
Israel has two priorities: to bring the hostages home and to bring Hamas down. And those are intertwined. We have to bring the hostages home. We know they are being starved and tortured and held in the most inhumane conditions in underground tunnels. But we also have to bring Hamas down, or it will do this again. Because Hamas is promising to do October 7th again and again. It's proud of it. It's proud of the acts of barbarism. It's proud of killing the Bibas children. It's proud of those atrocities. And we want to bring the hostages home. That means they have to sleep safely in their homes and not be afraid that Hamas is going to invade tomorrow and take them hostage again. So everyone in Israel agrees we have to achieve these two goals: bring the hostages home, bring Hamas down, and then we can open a new chapter, a new opportunity for peace in the region when the Hamas regime in Gaza is part of Gaza's history and not part of its future.
Eylon Levy, former Israeli government spokesperson, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Anytime. Thank you.
Let's take a look at the top business news. Stocks rose in early European trading on Wednesday, and the euro held near a 5-month high. That was helped by news that Ukraine would support a US proposal for a 30-day ceasefire, but fears around America's tariff plans keep traders cautious. On Tuesday, markets were left scrambling on Wall Street after President Trump threatened to double steel and aluminium tariffs on Canada to 50%. He then reversed course. Porsche is warning that lower sales, high costs and trade concerns would hurt this year's earnings, even before a possible hike in US tariffs on EU imports. The car maker is assessing how to pass possible American tariffs on to consumers, implying vehicle prices could rise. Like its parent company Volkswagen, Porsche is in the midst of a cost-cutting drive, shrinking its workforce by nearly 4,000 jobs and planning even further cuts. Turning to sports news now, when Paris Saint-Germain defeated Liverpool in a penalty shootout in Barcelona, Bayern Munich and Inter Milan in the quarter-finals of the Champions League. PSG beat Liverpool 1-0 on Tuesday night to level the aggregate score at 1-1. Ukrainian tennis player Elena Svitolina says she has received love and support from the US public during her return to Indian Wells last 8. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky clashed with his US counterpart Donald Trump in a heated exchange at the White House last month. The countries have since resumed talks, and Ukraine is ready to accept an immediate 30-day ceasefire with Russia, which was proposed by the US. Now, a reminder of our top stories. Pressure on Putin as Ukraine agrees to Trump's ceasefire proposal. Trump's trade war intensifies as Canada and Europe announce retaliatory tariffs on the US. The US joins indirect talks between Israel and Hamas on extending the fragile ceasefire in Gaza. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. The Riz Khan Show is coming up next. And of course, don't miss Tom Burgess-Watson with GNT. Good night and thank you for joining us.